My computer says it's 4 o'clock, so I will call to order the second monthly meeting of the Hendersonville City Council. We have 4 items on our consent agenda. Is there anything anyone would like to have moved to the regular agenda so it can be discussed? Not a motion to approve those items?
Madam Mayor, I move the City Council approve the consent agenda as presented.
Is there any discussion? Not. Those in favor of approving consent agenda items say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Ayes have it, and that motion is carried. And by the way, Mr. Smith is out of town. That's why he is not here, why we weren't waiting for him. Right, new business. It's the main thing we're going to be hearing about tonight, the Santee Water and Sewer Rate Study presentation.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the council. My name is Drew Finley. I am the assistant to the utilities director, and I think I've met most of you, but I think a few of you are new faces, so it's nice to meet those of you who I have not met. So, as the mayor mentioned, tonight we will be doing a presentation on the Water and Sewer Comprehensive Rate Study, Rate and Fee Study. And Stantec did this work for us. We presented this same presentation at the Water and Sewer Advisory Council on Monday night, got some great input and feedback from them, and we are eager to receive your input and feedback as well. And so with us tonight, we have Dave Hyder, who is managing principal with Stantec, and he'll be presenting this information, and we look forward to receiving your guidance on this important topic. So with that, I will turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Drew. Well, good evening. I do want to preface, again, Dave Hyder with Stantec. I want to preface that this is kind of an introductory presentation of the rate study. We don't have final results yet, so we're kind of taking you through before the study is complete. So, is there a question? Oh. Yeah, I do hear that a little bit. No problem. I hear it a little bit. Am I too close? No, Keep going. Testing. There we go. Is that better? All right. You don't need to hear me twice. Although some members have heard me twice now. She'll keep us honest this evening to make sure I'm saying the same things. In terms of what we have in terms of the presentation, our agenda, I'm going to go over the rate study process, just kind of take you through what we're going through with the city right now to look at the water and sewer rates. I want to talk about some of the key challenges that we see across the country when it comes to utilities, as well as some key challenges we've identified for the city. We'll look at your water and sewer rates as they stand right now. We'll talk about system development fees, and then wrap up with the project schedule. So just to start off, a little bit about Stantec. I'm part of Stantec's financial services team. There's about 40 of us, and we work all over the country, and we primarily focus on the financial and management aspects of environmental infrastructure, so water systems, sewer systems, stormwater, solid waste, things of that sort. And our primary focus is on water and sewer utility rate studies. We have worked for a number of communities across North Carolina and continue to do so, but we also bring national experience, having worked all over the country. One of the items that we often get involved with is helping utilities issue debt. So debt to fund their capital improvement plans. So in North Carolina, you have to present to the local government commission to issue debt, and so we often help with those debt issuances. So in terms of the rate study process, we really break it into 3 primary components, and I'll take you through each of those. The first one is the financial plan, and that really identifies how much. So how much revenue do we need to collect on the system? The next step would be cost of service, and that says from whom should we collect these revenues, depending upon what it costs to serve various types of customers. And then the final component is the rate design. How do we collect it? How do we actually structure the rates? And so looking at each of these, The first one, financial plan, and this is really what we're wrapping up right now and what we've been focused on in the last couple of months, is developing a forecast of your revenue requirements on the system. So what that is it's the cost of providing water and sewer service today, but then also looking forward. Typically, we look over a 10-year period. So we have a financial plan, financial model that's forecasted out over that 10-year period. And it identifies your system operating costs, both now and into the future. It looks at the capital investments that you have coming at you. It looks at any existing debt service for prior capital investments. And so ultimately, we get a sense for over the next 10 years, what does it cost on an annual basis to provide water and sewer service? And then we compare that with a revenue forecast. So we take your system demands, both now and into the future, customer counts, how you're seeing growth in the system. And we develop a forecast of revenues at your current rates to get a sense for how much revenue do we anticipate going forward. And then we can compare the revenue requirements with the revenue forecast to determine, are we able to meet some key metrics? First off, do we have sufficient revenues to meet those revenue requirements? Do we have the ability to meet some reserve targets, make sure we maintain adequate balances? And then also, are we meeting any debt obligations we have, such as debt service coverage? So the next step then is the cost of service. And this gets really into some of the nitty-gritty in terms of the weeds, looking at how individual customer classes, so residential versus commercial versus industrial, what does it cost to actually serve them? And there are industry standards that are used to look at what does it cost to serve commercial customers because of the types of demands they place in the system in comparison to residential customers. And we actually look at it on a functional basis. So what does it cost to provide the source of supply, the actual water treatment, the transmission, the distribution system, and ultimately our goal is to get to where we're setting rates that are aligned with that cost of service. And then the final component is the rate design, and this is how you collect, how you structure the rates. And we always say that this is where some of the art comes in terms of how you want to meet specific goals and objectives in terms of your rate structure. So this gets into how big is your fixed charge, how does it scale, what do your volume rates look like, and ultimately we're looking at balancing some competing needs. So I've identified here, you can have a tremendous amount of revenue stability, but you have to balance that with the fact that that generally would go against a conservation type rate structure, and I'll dive into more of these in a minute. But again, this is part of the key discussion this evening. So with that background, I just want to talk about some of the key challenges. And these are really the key challenges that we see around the industry. We've been dealing with these for a number of years now, but I'm going to take you through each of them. The first one is just reductions in use. And so we do see around the country that customers are using less and less water on a per account basis. And so while that's good from a conservation standpoint, metered water use is your cash register for the utility. So that's ultimately how you get your revenues. And so to the extent that you continue to see reductions in use, that has a direct impact on the revenues of the system. And we have seen some pretty substantial reductions across the country in terms of individuals using less. And therefore, there are communities that have to raise rates just to keep their revenues flat because folks are using less and less. The good side to using less and less is ultimately maybe it delays when you need to construct your next facility. So it allows you to prolong the capacity you have in an existing system, but it does impact your revenues. Another key issue is probably the most significant is just aging infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure that's been constructed was put in 50 to 70 years ago, and so we're dealing with now around the country having to replace that infrastructure, and it's not cheap to do so. We have regulatory and resiliency requirements. So associated with the Clean Water Act, each time they require you to do something additional, there's costs associated with that, so that's had some significant impacts on systems. We're also seeing the aging of the workforce. A lot of your key operators have been doing their work for a number of years, and as they age out, it's difficult to get those trained operators in place. Very expensive to find them and to get them in place. That's been a challenge. We're seeing recently operational cost increase significantly with chemicals and energy. And ultimately, when you bring all these together, one of the key challenges that the industry is grappling with is how do we address all this, maintain sustainability in the systems, but provide customer affordability? So that's really been a key focus. So that's what we see around the country, and you're dealing with a number of those issues, but one of the things we've noticed thus far in looking at the financial plan is that one of the key challenges facing the city is the fact that you have a significant amount of investment in the systems going forward. So this graphic here shows your planned capital improvements over the next 10 plus years. And I do need to emphasize that 2032 is 2032 plus. It's not just that particular year. But you're looking at, based on this plan, about $300 million in water and sewer capital investments. You can see the various categories. Some of it's equipment, some of it's repair and replacement. But a fair amount of it is expansion capacity-related projects, which is shown there in the blue. And the issue is going to be, okay, how do you fund and how do you take care of all this investment and maintain water and sewer rates that are affordable, and the challenges there. And I'll talk about system development fees in a minute, but currently, all of this currently needs to be funded from water and sewer rates, as that's the sole source of revenues that you have for the water and sewer systems. So next, I just want to talk a little bit about your water and sewer rate structures. So pull up some pricing goals and objectives, just to provide you with a framework of what utilities typically look at when they're thinking about, okay, how do we price and meet these specific goals for our system? And as I mentioned, customer affordability is certainly one of the more important ones, the ability to provide service for basic needs at an affordable rate. We also want to make sure we're providing rate and revenue stability, so that gets to limiting the annual volatility in the revenues you see on the system, but also the volatility in terms of rate adjustments, so limiting rate shock within the community. We want to try to align the cost of service in the utility bill so that as somebody uses a service, they're getting the message of what it actually costs to serve them. We can come up with a fantastic rate structure, but if you can't administer it or communicate it, then it's not going to be very effective. So we need to be able to keep it simple and easy to understand. And then we want to have a legally defensible rate structure. And generally that just means that you can't be arbitrary in terms of how you set rates. They need to be cost-based. And so I wanted to pull up your current water rate structure. So this is how you currently charge, and these are your current rates in place today. What you'll notice is that you have water-based charges, and so those are charges that are scaled based upon the size of the meter serving the customer. You have inside and outside city rates. And these charges, the base charges, are charged regardless of whether somebody uses water or not. So if you're out of town, you're going to pay those base charges regardless. And they provide fixed revenue on your system. Then we look at the water usage rates. You have broken down into several customer classes. The first is residential. And residential has what we would typically call an inclining block rate structure. So the more water you use, the more expensive it becomes as you go through the blocks. So for example, once you use over 6,000 gallons, it becomes $4.93 inside the city. And this is on a monthly basis. Once you go over 14,000, it becomes $5.60 per 1,000 gallons for each per 1,000 gallons over. And on the commercial side, you have a declining block rate structure. So the more water you use, the cheaper it becomes, kind of the opposite of the residential. Irrigation is just like residential, except it just has some bigger blocks. And then municipal and wholesale and bulk water are all charged at a uniform rate. And so I've got some observations just in terms of initial looks at your rate structure, and I'm going to bounce back and forth so we can kind of compare what you're currently doing in some of these observations. But in terms of the base charges, they do provide revenue stability, so you get that revenue regardless, and a lot of your cost in providing service is fixed. So you get that revenue whether individuals use the service or not, and it helps provide that revenue stability. One of the things that you could potentially do is increase the amount of revenue that you collect in those fixed charges. You're collecting currently on the water side about 20% of your revenue, 24% of your revenue in those fixed charges. You could move more to something like 30%. That would provide more revenue stability, but that would mean the charges would go up. And then the other alternative, or in addition to that, would be to consider potentially alternative scaling between the meters. And so if I go back, one of the things we notice is that while you scale the fixed charges by meter size, they don't scale very aggressively. So if you were to set your fixed charges next to a neighboring community's fixed charges, you'd notice that once you get into the 3, the 4, the 6, and the 8 inch, they're a lot more expensive in terms of fixed charges. And the reason for that is because there are industry standards in terms of how you scale these fixed charges based upon the capacity of the meter. So if you're an 8-inch meter, you can use a lot more water than if you're a 3/4-inch meter. And so one option would be to consider scaling these at a more aggressive pace that would be more in line with industry standards. A couple observations on the residential irrigation inclining block rate. That certainly is designed to promote conservation, so you're trying to encourage people to use water wisely. Some potential modifications to that would be that you could change the tier quantities. So instead of 0 to 6, you could make those tiers smaller. You could also have some difference in pricing between the tiers. So if I flip back real quick, you'll notice that there isn't much of a price change as you go from above 6,000. You're going from $448 to $493. And so if somebody uses 8,000 gallons, they're likely not going to realize that they're being charged that much, a little bit more. So you could argue that it's not sending a very strong conservation signal. So that's something we could look at as more aggressive conservation signaling there. And then another thing we notice is that the vast majority of your usage for single-family residential is falling in that first 0 to 6,000. I think it's close to 90% of your customers don't go outside of that. And so, oops, went the wrong way. And so one option, and a lot of communities are considering this these days, is you could have a smaller tier in there. You could say 0 to 3,000 gallons is at a lifeline rate. So you could have an even lower rate for the first quantities of water. Communities are doing that just to say, well, for your basic indoor needs, we're going to set this at a reduced rate. Would be some options you could consider in terms of changing the structure there. In terms of the commercial industrial declining block rates, those structures are very uncommon these days. You don't see many communities that have declining block rates. We used to see it a lot up in the Northeast as folks were trying to encourage industrial development, things of that sort. And I know the city plans to move to a uniform rate in fiscal year 24. So we would agree and think that that's the right thing to do. And then the final item is just that you, kind of unique in that you serve more customers water service outside the city than you do inside the city. So you really serve as a regional service provider. And therefore, just calls into question the differential that you have in place, and potentially would it make sense to get rid of that differential. And I know the city's planning and has been moving towards eliminating that differential over time. So the plan is to eliminate it by 2030, and we also think that that's a smart move. So just wanted to, as we go through this process, kind of give you some examples of, I've listed on that prior slide some of the potential changes, and this is where you can get into the pricing goals and objectives and some of the competing issues. So if we were to take the first recommendation or suggestion to increase the amount of revenue you collect in the base charges, that would increase your revenue stability on the system. You'd get more revenue guaranteed, but that potentially decreases the conservation signal. Somebody could say, well, I'm paying a fixed charge that's relatively high, I'm just going to use regardless, I'm not going to conserve. So you potentially have those competing issues. You could add in a lifeline tier, as I mentioned, that would potentially enhance affordability, but it can be a little bit more confusing as you have more tiers. So the administrative burden and the ability to communicate it can be a little bit challenging. You could increase the tier pricing, as I talked about, send more of a conservation signal. That would certainly do that. But what that also does is it potentially decreases the revenue stability on the system, because if you have relatively high differentials between your rates and then you have an unusually wet year, you could see your revenues jump up and down because your rates are scaled at a higher rate. And then finally, the elimination of the commercial declining block rate, that does align with cost of service, but ultimately that is going to have some impact on your commercial users as they have to pay the same rate and they don't get that declining block rate. So finally, just in terms of rates, this is your sewer rate structure, similar to water, particularly on the base charges. You can see you have inside, outside. They scale based on meter size. Similar observations in that you could collect more in the base service charges and you could scale them at a more aggressive clip. On the usage side, it's pretty straightforward. You have inside, outside, no blocks, no tiers. So all usage is at $633 inside the city and $950 outside the city for residential and commercial customers. All public schools pay $633. And then wholesale municipal, Henderson County and internal pays the $9.50. So really not a lot of suggestions or observations when it comes to the sewer rates, other than the potential modifications to the base charges. So just wanted to give you a kind of a snapshot of where you are right now. We always think it's important to lay out what people pay for other utilities. So right now, on average, throughout the year, a typical single-family home will pay about $150 a month on electricity. They'll pay $105 on cell phone service. And right now, with your current typical single-family uses about 3,000 gallons a month, they're paying $50 a month for water and sewer service, which is less than the North Carolina average, which is about $60 per month. So still a very, very affordable utility in comparison to what you pay for other utilities. Also just wanted to provide a snapshot of, these are similarly sized utilities across North Carolina. And the average amongst these utilities, this is again for single family at 3,000 gallons per month. The average is about $50, and that's right where you are, so you do fall right into the middle. This was not staged or planned. These are just the similar sized utilities that we were given, and you do fall right there in the middle. You'll see the differences in terms of water and sewer components of the bill, but again, you're right there, right in the middle.
Yeah. David, if I could make one comment, I think on Monday night when we had the conversation with the Water and Sewer Advisory Committee, one of the questions that was brought up was which one of these are authorities? And it was David keenly pointed out that it just so happened that the two authorities are on the far right there, and that their rates or their bill comparisons are the highest of the group. You do see some regional city-run systems, like you see the Two Rivers utility from Gastonia and Winston-Salem, Forsyth County there, and I guess so at Salisbury, Rowan, and even Charlotte Water for that matter. But it was interesting to have the conversation about there is a little bit, and I think, David, what I think I understand you said to the group was there's some loss of efficiencies, and I don't know if efficiency is the right terms, but when you are an authority or utility, those 100% of the cost for all components of service are handled by the authority versus when they are part of a city government. There is some advantages to spread part of the cost. The cost is shared among multiple funds, I think is what I heard you say.
Yeah, that is true. The advisory group was asking why there's such differences between some of the cities, and that is one of the issues. Another issue would be there are cities that don't fully allocate costs to the utilities. So if you have finance and IT and administration, they may not transfer those over to the utilities, and therefore they have lower water and sewer rates as well. So it's kind of both sides of the coin. But if you are a standalone entity, you do have to have your own finance, and you don't have those shared services. So you generally do see a little bit higher there. But I always argue it's difficult to get true apples to apples comparisons, because depending on where you get your water from, your source of supply, where you are in terms of your reinvestment cycle, how much growth you have in your system, if you've been proactively running a sustainable utility. There are communities that don't invest in the systems like they should, and therefore they have rates that are lower than they should be, and they're going to have to go up substantially as they start to address issues. So there's a lot of factors that go into what utilities charge for service. And this is just a snapshot. This is just single family. At the end of the study, we'll provide comparisons for commercial, industrial, and a wider range so you can get a sense.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just that the council may hear those comments or questions in the community, so I wanted to let them know what the advisory committee was talking about.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to go on to talk about system development fees, but I did want to mention that all of these other communities do charge system development fees, just to give you a sense for who is charging them. So let me just talk about what those are. So system development fees are fees that are charged for new connections joining the water and sewer system. They're also charged for an existing connection that needs to increase their capacity. So if you're doing a tear down and you need more capacity, you can charge a system development fee for that as well. The intent of system development fees is to recover the cost of providing water and sewer system capacity. So you have to build before the connection happens. So the intent is that growth would pay for growth. The fees are applied based on units of service. So if you're a larger customer joining the system, you would pay a scaled higher system development fee representing the potential demand. And then in North Carolina, these fees are legislated. So the Public Water and Sewer System Development Fee Act was passed in July of 2017. And so there are very prescriptive ways that you have to go about setting these fees, calculating them, how you have to publish them and share them with the public over a 45-day comment period and things of that sort. So there is real strong guidance in terms of these fees within the state. When we look at the fees, getting into the weeds a little bit, there's 3 approaches that are laid out within the System Development Fee Act. These are common in the industry in terms of how you calculate them. So you can calculate the fees based on what's called the buy-in method, and this essentially looks at what have we built to date, and we're going to set the fees based on what it costs to build today current system capacity. And typically you'd use that type of approach if you have a lot of capacity to sell, so you're not necessarily planning to expand the system anytime soon. The flip side would be the incremental cost approach, and this would be, say, we're going to set these system development fees based upon what's in our capital improvement plan to increase system capacity, and that's done when you have limited or no capacity to sell. And then you can do what's a hybrid or a combined approach where you take the average of the two and say, well, we have capacity to sell, so we're going to use our existing systems, plus we are expanding our system in the CIP, and therefore we're going to use that combined approach. So those are the specific approaches you have to use given the System Development Fee Act. And then another component is that you have to scale them based upon units of service. And so what's typically done, very common in the state and around the country, is to scale the system development fees based upon the size of the meter associated with the service. So, and these scaling factors are what American Water Works Association publishes for the capacity of the meter. And so, for example, let's say we had a $2,000 system development fee for a single family, which typically has a 3/4 inch meter. Then you would just scale that up. So if you're a 6-inch meter, it would be 43 times that $2,000. So the fees do get substantial as you get larger. Most communities don't see too many 6-inch meters joining their system. That's pretty rare. It's going to be more in the 2 to 3 inch if it's a commercial, and then 3/4 inch if it's single family. But you do need to scale them based upon some type of unit of service. And so just some considerations. System development fees do allow you to recover at least a portion of the cost of constructing system infrastructure. So if you recall back to that graphic I showed, you do have a significant amount of planned expansion related capital costs. So these would allow you to fund some of that. If you don't have system development fees in place, the full cost of infrastructure is on the existing users. You don't really have another revenue source. Some of the pushback that we often see with system development fees is there's concern about potential impact on development, as the fees can be substantial for larger meters. But I would argue that most communities in the state do have system development fees, so developers and individuals are used to paying them. As I mentioned in the comparison, all of those communities do have system development fees. There are requirements and limitations on the use of system development fees given the legislation, so you can't use the system development fees to fund operating costs. You need to track them in a separate fund. And there are limitations in terms of how you can actually use them based on the approach that you use to set them. So if you set your fees based on that incremental CIP approach, you can't use the system development fees to fund repair and replacement capital projects. But if you use the combined or the buy-in approach, you can use it to fund repair and replacements in the system. So some things to consider there. And then just to wrap up, in terms of our project schedule, as I mentioned, we're complete on the financial plan portion at this point. We're knee-deep in the cost of service and system development fee calculations. We had a meeting earlier today to talk about those. And then December, we're working on the rate design. We'll also be helping in December putting together an agreed-upon procedures letter, which is what the LGC requires for the issuance of debt, because you are planning on issuing some revenue bonds for the utility, and then we plan on wrapping up with our initial recommendations in February. So I've gone over a lot. I'd be happy to pop back to any slides and answer any questions you may have.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
When, so when you're making the projections of revenue forecasting, what type of model do you use for that? Is it, I don't know, is it a percentage based, or is there like a standard as far as plan development or known plan development? Like, what is the way you calculate that?
In terms of revenues or expenditures?
Revenues.
Revenues. Yeah, so we have talked with staff, and what we essentially do is a percentage-based, assume a certain growth percentage inside the city and a certain growth percentage outside the city, both for water and for sewer. And we were just talking about that today. I think we're looking at maybe about 0.5% inside the city and 1% outside the city. But that's the great thing about a model, is we can toggle those and look at what impact it has if we see a uptick or a slowdown in growth.
Like on a scale of conservatism, where would that projection fall?
I think that's pretty conservative. And that's generally what we want to do. We want to be conservative on the expense side by saying they're going to be more than we expect, and conservative on the revenue side to say it's going to be less development than expected, but ultimately coming to a reasonableness there in terms of what the forecast would be.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay, I have some more questions.
Yes.
Sorry. So with the increased regulatory requirements from the federal government, are they in any way subsidizing some of the costs for local governments?
Yeah, so there are, for example, the latest is with the lead service line replacements. There are going to be funds that are coming ultimately to the state, but they're being administered through the state SRF, or local state revolving loan fund is ultimately administering them. And from what I understand, they're going to continue to be in the form of just low interest rate loans.
That's nice of them.
Yes.
Okay, last question. On your graph, you had the 92 million plus. So how far is the plus? Like, what is that? Is it 10 years, 15?
Yeah, so you maintain the city maintains a CIP in utilities that says this is what we know we need to do. And I think I know in that last year where it's the plus, my understanding is that's probably in the next 5 to 10 years after that.
Okay.
And so what we do in the financial modeling is we do assume some level that you're not going to fund $92 million in 2032. That you'll fund a portion of that, and then the rest would happen afterwards.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think Councilmember Hensley and City Council, I think one of the things we've had discussion when we first saw this presentation is what is the true implementation rate of the capital improvement projects? Because it's a plan, right? I mean, so, and by the time you get into design, bidding, loan, revenue, if we're doing revenue bonds, so we're having that discussion as a staff is we still want to be conservative, and we still want to have the projects on the list from an expenditure side. And I'm looking around the room, anybody pull me back if I'm too far out on a limb here, but I think one of the conversations that we'll have is does it make sense to look at what's in the plan and put, and I think part of the rate model will look at, okay, we have 100% projected, but in reality, we're only going to spend 80% of that amount, and how does that impact the rates? I think that's the conversation we had, and there's opportunities in the model to toggle that. I think David shared that with us. So.
Yeah, that's such a common issue that we have a specific place in the model where we do execution factor on capital, because I've yet to see a utility that executes 100% of their CIP. I've seen them as low as 20%, but usually it's better than that. But yeah, we do factor that in as well.
Okay.
Yep.
Just a little bit of history about system development charges. We did have system development charges, the mayor will remember, for a number of years, and previous council, we had received a lot of pushback from the business community and in the county and everything, and we went to strictly a user rate where basically the system development charges are in the user rates, where we're all paying for it. I think where we are from a staff perspective, and the reason that we would encourage you to at least consider system development charges is with the growth we're having, and the biggest impact of that growth is going to be on your large facilities, your water treatment plant and your wastewater treatment plant, and the idea that the ratepayers as we are today, we're paying for improvements to the system, and we've been paying all along, and then you have new development come in, large developers. If we don't have those folks, we may have to make improvements, and they haven't been paying into the system. So the idea with the system development charges is they're buying into the system. We're all stockholders of the system, and when and this may go against the legislation, so legal team, keep me out of trouble, but the idea is that with the new development, we're asking them to buy into the system to help pay for the improvements that are needed because of the development and the growth, so that it doesn't put all the charges on the ratepayer. So just food for thought. I mean, it's a philosophy and, decision that, in a policy decision the council will have to make as it relates to system development charges. And, it all plays into capital improvements, and that's the biggest expense that we have is related to capital improvement. So. Okay, so.
Other questions?
I would be really interested in seeing one of those fancy graphs where it shows system development fees across the state, and maybe a timeline of when those system development fees were introduced at that particular service provider.
Yep.
And then maybe even some comparison as far as industrial growth. I don't know, just to see if there's
Yeah, if it's had an impact.
a timeline of differences, or are these industrial growth clusters now happening in areas where there is less development of system development fees, or is that now just like a universal standard and they just expect it? So.
Yeah. The level of development might be difficult to track to some degree. We could certainly have a statewide, the Environmental Finance Center, UNC, provides a really good survey of all utilities across the state. With the legislation that went in place in 2017, every single community that had a system development fee had to actually have a study done to validate that it was done appropriately. So there's been a lot of information provided in terms of what folks are charging, and based on my experience, they are pretty standard across the state. Most communities have them. It isn't uncommon to just list what the system development fees are up to a certain meter size, to say, well, we're going to list what it is for 5/8, 1 inch, up to 2 inch, and then once you get above that, it could be based upon actual flows or things of that sort. So some communities will bifurcate them in that manner and not publish and say it's $100,000 for a 6-inch meter,
Okay.
but more of a, I don't want to say negotiated, but essentially what's the demand that they're actually going to put on the system, and base the fees based on that.
Anything else? All right,
Okay,
we thank you for
I
this.
really appreciate the opportunity.
Interim report that you've been working on, and forward to hearing more as you and Stantec get more information.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That is all the business we have, but we do need a closed session.
Madam Mayor, I move that City Council enter closed session pursuant to NCGS Statute 143-318.11A1 and 6 to prevent the disclosure of information that is privileged or confidential pursuant to the law of the state or of the United States, or not considered a public record within the meaning of Chapter 132 of the General Statutes and the public body, and to consider the qualifications, competence, performance, character, fitness of an individual public officer or employee.
Thank you. Is there any discussion? Not. Those in favor of entering closed session say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Ayes have it, and we